To this book launch of Jonathan Cole's recent publication, Christian Political Theology in an Age of Discontent. It's a beautiful set of essays, and there is a story behind it which Jonathan will tell at some stage. Before that, Professor Wayne Hudson, who's a research professor at Charles Sturt University, will be invited in a moment to launch the book. Can I just say, I'm just delighted that Jonathan is a part of this place. Jonathan's been here for 4 or 5 years, first of all as an postgraduate, a doctoral student, and finished his doctoral work here and stayed on, and is now the Assistant Director of the Public and Contextual Theology Research Centre with me, and it's a delight to have a colleague like Jonathan. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor Wayne Hudson and welcome Wayne to launch this book. And Wayne, we are delighted that you're ready, willing and able to do that, and we look forward to what you have to say. Could you welcome Wayne?
Well, ladies and gentlemen, as you know, honesty is always the best policy, and I didn't know I was launching this book 6 minutes ago. I did know I was adding to the conversation, but I'm going to do more than add to it, it seems. So this will be as good as I can make it, but it is a little bit more ad lib than I'd planned, and I will change it as we go with your faces. So I rely on you to provide the next line after the prompt, and that should work, I think. Jonathan is a tremendous asset to PACT. He's a tremendous asset to our university. Everything's more efficient when Jonathan's involved. Jonathan has got drive, contemporary technology, and an engaged political mind. And the rest of us are struggling under all of those categories. He's produced this extremely interesting volume, and he's done it because he's very strategic. I wouldn't describe myself or anyone else in this room as strategic except for the bishop, but Jonathan is very, very strategic. I think that's fair. Both bishops. Yeah, Jonathan is one of those people who does something to have an impact, and he knows what the impact will be, and what he does will achieve it. And this is very much this kind of book. So this is a collection of essays by Jonathan, many previously published, each of them aimed at moving his audience to a position that Jonathan favours. So this is polemical, political writing. This is not the 16-volume work on the subject, and it's not his doctoral thesis, you'll be most relieved to know. It is very different from his doctoral thesis, which is academical and deeply learned, not only about Oliver O'Donovan, but about contemporary Greek Orthodox theology. And it's in the process of being turned into an outstanding book. So if you came expecting the doctoral thesis, this is not it. These are essays, occasional pieces, strategic in intent, designed to change opinion, and very much oriented to the American part of the audience. I think it's fair to say probably the evangelical part of the American audience, which is vast. Others will read it with benefit, but those whose minds will be changed are those that Jonathan has targeted, which is, broadly speaking, an American quasi-evangelical public who probably see themselves as more politically mature than their neighbours, certainly as more biblical than their neighbours, and, let's face it, much more Christian than anyone else they know. All of this is, as you might understand, contestable. And everything Jonathan says in the book is to some degree contestable, and that's why he says it. Thesis is not like that, but this is. So I'm going to say some very positive things about it. Then I'm going to introduce a bit of darkness, because Jonathan has asked for it. And then I'm going to raise a few problems and hopefully sit down before the wine disappears. Now, this collection of essays gives us an incisive overview of the field of political theology for a very carefully calculated audience. It is wide-ranging and incisive, and it tells the readers much that they do not know. You could be unkind and say everything that they do not know is in this book. It is about the need for more clarity and more political maturity than political theology currently shows. Jonathan is outstandingly good, as an ANU politics graduate, at seeing how little politics there is in political theology, and how you wouldn't want any political theologian you met recently to be organising your economy or your army, and probably not your state. So this is a very critical book. It's engaged, and it's very strong on the total failure of political theology, in English particularly, to engage with actual political life and political reality. It's also very strong on the incoherence of the field. Jonathan sets that out very well and very clearly. There's no definition of political theology anywhere that makes any sense. Most political theologians can't keep to the one they adopted on page 1. And it really is a very disturbed body of literature in which there are completely outstanding people, and you'll know their names, 8 and 9 to 12, you'll know well. I gave a talk on this in New York at the beginning of the year, and I found 250 political theologians, but we won't discuss them tonight. But if you just take the ones you know very well, there are many wonderful people, and they've made massive contributions. But when you sit back in the cool of the afternoon and say, what do you mean by political theology? And how do you arrive at the judgments you advance, and how do you justify them in the presence of an enemy? There's not that much that really grips. Oliver O'Donovan's name comes to mind, Moltmann's name comes to mind. There's a long list of eminent persons that we can read with merit. But Jonathan's point is that none of them really are very into the political as such, and none of them, I think, have even a basic grasp of the contemporary global situation. So if you go to the Germans, and I'm expert in that area, they're very lovely people, and they're in the Second World War, and they speak English quite nicely too, and they don't know a single Asian language, and they haven't got a clue about President Xi and what's happening in China. So they're not in the present, effectively. If you go to the Latin Americans, they're mainly dead, but the ones that are still alive couldn't fix their country, couldn't do anything for women, and are really now period pieces of a fairly amusing kind. The women are better, but the men are borderline, I think. If you go to China and Korea, you do have political theologians of distinction, but they're on the way to jail, and they will be jailed in China quite soon. In fact, I don't know that Christianity will survive in China. The Chinese government has now decided it will retranslate the Bible to make sure it has clear Chinese characteristics, and has told Chinese Christians they can't have the first of the 10 Commandments because that's not Chinese. So Jonathan's point is to approach a great literature with a very critical eye on coherence and political realism. That's where he makes the contribution. The other contribution is to tell you a great deal about a great deal of this. And that's extremely helpful for its audience, because I don't think theology students anywhere in the English-speaking world would know half of what's in this book. I think most people in this room wouldn't know 2/3 of what this book, and when I read it, to my great benefit, I didn't know about 90% of it, Jonathan, so thank you. It was a big help to me. Now, having said that, no, I'm not beginning the critique. No. We then have to face the fact that the range of the book is vast, and as a result, it's fair to say that the treatment of each individual aspect is perhaps contestable, or others might not agree. I think that is totally fair, because if you talk, as Jonathan does, about so many major people, then obviously people who spent their whole lives on one of them are going to come along and say not on page 507 and not the third footnote. Well, I think that's fair. But what Jonathan does is give the overview, and he gives a very cold-headed analysis of each of the people he discusses. And he goes through a huge amount of stuff. I mean, there's a brilliant chapter on Thomas Hobbes. I think it's the most brilliant chapter in the book. Unlike almost anyone in the United States, he understands that Hobbes was Christian, advocating a totally serious political theology, not an atheist, none of it, thank you. Yes, God's corporeal, but then that's the universe Hobbes is designing. He's extremely good in the critique of Pabst and Milbank. I'm a friend of both John Milbank and Adrian Pabst, but I think what they say about liberalism is cuckoo. And Jonathan very carefully explains what the problems with it are. Not underestimating the contribution either. He has a very good discussion of Calvin. I wasn't happy with it, of course, because it's not a French Calvin. And if you read Calvin and don't understand that he's a French humanist, then we end up in Scotland, where I don't want to go, or South Africa, where I've been. But it's a very good discussion, and he does mention Doyevert, who some people here will know about, and he also deals very well, I think, with Cowper, who's a crucial figure for this whole discussion and very much neglected in Australia. Americans, thank God, do know about him, particularly at Princeton. Dutch obviously know. He was Prime Minister of the Netherlands. He's an outstanding figure in the Calvinist tradition, and any Christian could learn a lot from Adam Cowper, in my humble opinion. Jonathan's quite sound on it. The Calvinist aspect's interesting. He also has stuff on the American conservative movement. He's a Kirkian conservative himself. Now that does worry me half the week. I'll tell you about that. But he does explain quite well, I think, what the connection between Christianity and American conservatism is. He has 2 chapters on why they vote for Trump and why they think Trump is a divine gift to Israel in these difficult times of discontent. I wasn't persuaded by the truth of any of this, but Jonathan isn't there arguing for the view. He's explaining it to people like me who don't quite get it. And he does it extremely well. So every chapter in this book is worth reading, and some of them, frankly, you'll have to underline. I underlined about half of it. There's a lot of stuff in this book that expands your knowledge or corrects a one-sided judgment you've made. I myself have made one-sided judgments about many people mentioned in the book. I think that's fair. And there's a special interest perhaps for some people in Oliver O'Donovan. Jonathan's rather critical of Oliver O'Donovan on the question of the definition of politics. I can't say how just or unjust that is, but he is equally critical, I think, of Yoder and Ellul and various other people. So if you get in the book, you're going to get your head cut off to some degree, and that's probably better than uncontrolled praise. I now want to move a little bit to where I'm less persuaded, or where I, not exactly dissent, but where I feel in the next 46 volumes you will amplify your views. Jonathan defines political theology, and that's good, but he doesn't define theology or political, and he says that very clearly many times. But I think that's very clever, but I think it's too clever by half, because if we don't know what we mean by theology, where are we? And if we don't know what political is, well, that's got problems too. Jonathan often talks as though political is somehow a separate partitional reality discovered in Greece and continued thereafter. That's not what the history shows. He talks about theology as though we all kind of understand what that is. That's quite characteristic of evangelical thinkers, but it is a problem to those of us who read books because we're not too sure what theology is, depending on which theologian you're talking about, which century, which part of the world. For example, would you like to talk about Christian theology in Yemen? Probably not. So I think the definition of political theology he gives is very moving, but I wasn't convinced, really. Political theology is a mode of political analysis that proceeds from the conviction that politics, however defined, is embedded within a Christian ontology and shaped to some extent by a Christian historical teleology. Well, that's fine, except that that's the sort of thing the Anaras or Greeks say, because they don't do philosophy in a serious sense. They use words like ontology, but they don't know how it differs from metaphysics. They use words like teleology, but they're not quite sure what that is either. I think the definition is too high, too pretentious and too brilliant to be usable, and I think in the next book I'd re-tease that a bit. A few more points. Well, no, it's all available in print. I think one problem I did have with the book is that it doesn't really crack the Carl Schmitt problem. Well, no one in the world has cracked the Carl Schmitt problem, so it's a very minor criticism, Jonathan. But it is a problem because all law schools in the world now teach Carl Schmitt. Carl Schmitt is now one of the most influential thinkers of the 21st century. He was the major legal theorist of the Third Reich. He's not exactly the sort of person you'd expect Christians to be too happy with. His views are vitriolic and pretty amazing and violently anti-Semitic. But it's not easy to understand his books on political theology, what he means by it. I was going to talk about that a bit today, but I probably will leave it out. I'll just flash it quickly. Schmitt emerges out of 40 years of German Jewish discussion about the nature of the Augenblick. What this is an eschatology of time. It's the idea that the reality we experience is a function of the moment, of the Augenblick, which is an access to eternity. So it's an eschatological, elliptical theory of time. No one in England has ever said anything like that to my knowledge. No one in Australia will survive if they say anything like that. But Germans said that for 30 years, and I can go through them all. And many Jews said that. And there was the Jerusalem school. The most important political theology of the 20th century is not Schmitt. It's the Jerusalem school, and particularly the Jews. But the Christians don't read the Jews, particularly evangelicals don't, because they know what the Bible means. You see, you don't need to talk to the people who wrote it. And in the same way, the Jerusalem school, being Jewish, was, of course, eschatologically oriented. That is what they're on about. And Schmidt's coming out of that background, as well as out of 19th century Catholic reaction. The other side of Carl Schmitt, he thinks that anyone who wanted to murder the peasants, shoot the women, and hang the heretics was really great. So you've got two different traditions merging in Carl Schmitt, and no one in the world's been able to explain why he had such an enormous influence. I think the answer is quite simple. I will give it to you and then move on. The answer is that Schmitt was able to tell them that although the world had secularized in a superficial sort of way, theology was the real content of the allegedly secular modern world. And that's an idea that's very deep, and clever people in the German Jewish world picked it up. And while they didn't like Schmitt and his political views or his legal views, they realized he'd touched a nerve. And I think that's very actual and important right now. I'm not a defender of Schmitt. Every year I go to New York and attack the Schmittians, you'll be glad to know. But there is something there that we can learn from. Well, I think I won't say anything else much about Jonathan's book, except to say that this is a brilliant young man, and we are to expect many more volumes, and we are to expect in them some clarification of the matters I've raised. I don't think it'll be in the next book. I think in 40 years' time, when one of your more minor books has become famous, you will... this has happened to me. I mean, I'll just tell you a personal story. Many, many years ago, before the world was invented almost, before the time of Christ, I wrote a book on Ernst Bloch. And I knew Ernst Bloch personally in Germany, and I wrote this book on him. And the best Marxists in the world thought it was a work of genius. It got pages of review in all the best British press. The Americans hated it and claimed it wasn't written in English, which may be true. And then it didn't really have a major impact. 50 years passed. It's now everywhere. The same book is being cited all over the world. But it has taken 50 years. I wrote something for Sydney University on English deism, which they hated, and later on I wrote 3 more volumes explaining it to them. That's now everywhere too, but that's over a 50-year time period. So, Jonathan, we look forward to the contributions that you'll make. They will be wonderful. They will make Pact world famous. We will make it... It will be easier for us to talk to our colleagues having talked to you, which is really a very good definition of a Pact scholar, I think. And you brought us together tonight in a very happy context. We praise you for your book. We praise you for your wonderful family. We praise you for your linguistic ability. Who else do you know has Arabic and modern Greek? And we praise you for your attention to the truth. And that's the most important characteristic. That's Jonathan. Buy the book with great pleasure, without preparation. I launched the book.
Well, it's always great to have you speak, Wayne. First of all, Jonathan, you're a very brave man. And secondly, Karl Ruschke wrote a foreword to this. It's the longest and most interesting foreword I've read from a book. 25 pages of a foreword. Now, there's a reason why Ruschke did that, and it has to do with what Wayne was speaking about. He recognised in these essays and their originality and power, notwithstanding some of the caveats that Wayne has flagged for future volumes, that here was a scholar of significant note in this domain, and he wanted to make it very clear, I think, that Jonathan belongs within a community of significant scholars in this work within the world, not just Canberra and not just Pact. So I'm glad that you're going to make Pact famous and do things in the international world. And it is a very significant honour that someone of Ruschke's significance in this domain of political theology has written such a careful and detailed analysis of political theology and located Jonathan within the international conversation. I think it's very significant indeed. So without further ado, Jonathan, you have a right of reply for about 2 minutes to Wayne.
Well, if only we could all ad-lib like Wayne Hudson. thank you, Wayne. And I should just say that I want to state for the record that I hope to be alive to see the impact of my work, because I'm going to be 83 years old in 40 years if I live that long. I'm a little older than I look, Wayne, but I don't know if I'll be around in 50. The best way I can thank Wayne is actually to quote with the change of one word, Oliver O'Donovan, who I think very wisely said that the lover of truth has no better friend than a sympathetic critic. And Wayne, you are the best of friends. Thank you. I'm asking Wayne to do this because I just know how entertaining and what a wonderful, lively, unique one-in-a-million type speaker he is. If you look in the acknowledgements, there are a range of people who are in no particular order, with the exception of one name, and that is Wayne Hudson, who is the first name. And we've had a very interesting journey together, because the first time I met Wayne, when I made the then mistake of sitting next to him at a seminar about a month before I undertook my doctoral work, the way I would describe him is as a grand inquisitor who, to my feeble mutterings and whimperings, pressed me to define what my research question was, which I couldn't do at the time. And I was a bit rattled, and then 6 months later, in a moment that has now become famous in the annals of St Mark's, Bruce was there. Wayne eviscerated my research proposal. And so it is a great honour and privilege to have Wayne introducing my book, because both of those initially kind of heart-stopping events proved to be really definitive for my journal. That research proposal deserved to be eviscerated, and it was the greatest thing that happened to me. And it forged a kind of partnership and friendship. And through that crucible, and it was a crucible, Wayne became, little I know on that first meeting, Grand Inquisitor, really one of my most important mentors. And so I wanted partly to ask Wayne to launch this book, although it turns out I didn't make that clear until about 30 minutes ago, as a way of thanking him, because I thought it had a nice kind of symmetry after everything we've been through, to actually be able to be up here with my first book. And Wayne, whatever merit and virtue this book has is undoubtedly deeply indebted to the anvil that is your mind, that has sharpened mine over these years. And certainly the failings, I'm sure, will be ironed out in another 5 years of daily discourse. So there isn't a lot of time. I could go on with the thank yous, but this is not the Academy Awards and it's not a thank you speech. So let me just say make a couple of brief remarks about the genesis of this book. It really was born of a place of frustration. And as a doctoral student in late 2016, about halfway through my doctorate in political theology, I was really frustrated, having had this background of 13 years working in 4 agencies in the Federal Public Service, having studied politics at postgraduate level prior to that. I was very frustrated in that for someone who was attracted to political theology because of my deep interest in politics, and as a Christian, I naturally wanted to see how politics interacted with my faith and what impact my faith ought to have on politics. And I was pretty much clueless. I worked out at the end of 13 years in the public service I couldn't answer the most basic questions on whether it's sovereignty or democracy from a Christian perspective. I was utterly frustrated that all of the political theologians I was reading were not answering these questions. Now, I'm sorry to say that I do not really answer any of them in the book as well. And really what this book does is really lay down the challenge. It's a plea, in a way, to political theologians. It's a plea to myself as much as to the audience, because I struggle and wrestle with these answers, to say something intelligible and meaningful about politics that is informed by traditional orthodox theological doctrines through the reading of the Bible. And it's actually an incredibly challenging task, as Wayne has very perceptively outlined. And this is the first sort of I'm a very extroverted thinker. I'm an extreme introvert in my private life, but I will talk to death anyone who cares to listen, and I'll just vomit out whatever's on my mind. So I plan to write regularly, and I am a prolific and rather promiscuous writer. I plan to just simply write my own analysis and wrestle with this challenge I've outlined with political theology throughout my career, and invite people to come along for the ride. So it is a provocative book, but it's not a provocative book from someone standing above, at the peak of the mountain, sort of arrogantly above all these mere mortals who are too dumb to understand politics and how it intersects with theology. This is me wrestling with these questions and urging other Christians to at least do a better job. And so the kind of critical engagement Wayne has offered is what I'm desperate for. I'm not necessarily asking everyone to agree with the particular analytical conclusions I come on any particular figure or question. I do hope to persuade them that the field is really pretty hopeless, and that I hope to engage people in a conversation that will help me, and I can help them to, at the very least, get greater insight, greater clarity around the questions about the methodology for actually thinking about this incredibly challenging issue. Because theology on its own is incredibly difficult. Politics on its own is incredibly difficult. Combining them is simply to double and compound the challenges. So it is, from my perspective, a more humble book than perhaps it reads. Just know that the critique applies to me as much as it does to anyone else. And as I outlined in the introduction, all I hope is what I hope in everything I write, which is to inform, stimulate, and provoke. And so I hope those of you who do me the honour of reading the book will be informed, stimulated, and provoked to your enrichment, and hopefully my enrichment. So thank you all for coming. Thanks again to Wayne, Stephen for hosting. I could go on with the thank yous as I say, and I'm starting to ramble, so I'm going to put an end to it right there. Thank you. Enjoy a wine, enjoy some company. Thank you again for the 30th time.
Thank you, Jonathan. Jonathan said it all. So thank you for coming and celebrating this occasion. Jonathan, we do admire you, and we want to encourage you in your work and your future. And it's a great place to be doing it from too. So I hope you enjoy that. So again, thank you, and enjoy a drink and a nibble and a conversation. And thank you for inviting us into the conversation that you so desperately desire. So thanks.